My mother-in-law stood over my dying cat with crocodile tears, screaming that I was a negligent pet owner who deserved to lose everything I loved. But when the veterinarian called with the toxicology report 3 days later, her face went white as she realized the very poison she had used was about to expose a family secret that would destroy her life and reveal the truth about who I really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of the emergency veterinary clinic cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor as I cradled Mabel, my 8-year-old tabby cat, in my arms. Her breathing had become labored and shallow, her once bright green eyes now glazed with pain. The orange and white fur that I had brushed lovingly every morning for years was now damp with perspiration, her small body trembling against my chest. "Please, you have to save her," I whispered to Dr. Patricia Henley, the emergency veterinarian who had been examining Mabel for the past 20 minutes. My voice cracked with desperation as I stroked the soft fur behind her ears, the same spot that always made her purr contentedly when she curled up beside me during quiet evenings at home. Dr. Henley's expression was grave as she completed her preliminary examination. Her experienced hands moved gently across Mabel's small frame, checking vital signs and reflexes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too many cases like this. The stethoscope around her neck caught the overhead light as she leaned closer, her brow furrowed with concern. "Miss Chen, I need to be honest with you," Dr. Henley said, her voice carrying the weight of difficult news. "Mabel's symptoms are consistent with poisoning. Her pupils are dilated, she's experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress, and her neurological responses are compromised. We need to run immediate blood work and begin aggressive treatment if we're going to have any chance of saving her." The words hit me like a physical blow. Poisoning. The word echoed in my mind as I tried to process what she was telling me. How could Mabel have been poisoned? I was meticulous about pet safety in my small apartment. Every household cleaner was stored in locked cabinets. Every plant was carefully researched to ensure it was non-toxic, and I never left food unattended that could harm her. "But how is that possible?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so careful with everything. She never goes outside and I watch her constantly. She's been perfectly fine all week until this morning when I found her like this." Dr. Henley's expression softened slightly, but her professional demeanor remained intact. Poisoning can happen in many ways, sometimes accidentally. Has she had access to any new foods, cleaning products, or has anyone else been caring for her recently? As she spoke, the waiting room door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Margaret Whitmore, my mother-in-law, strode into the examination room without waiting for permission, her perfectly coiffed silver hair catching the light, and her expensive pearl necklace clicking against her navy blue designer suit. Her presence immediately filled the small space with an air of authority and judgment that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "There you are, Elena," Margaret's voice cut through the clinical atmosphere like a blade. "I've been looking everywhere for you. When David told me you rushed out of the house in hysterics with that cat, I knew I had to come and see what drama you were creating now." I clutched Mabel tighter against my chest, instinctively protective of both of us in Margaret's presence. After 3 years of marriage to her son David, I had learned to recognize the particular tone she used when she was preparing to deliver one of her devastating verbal attacks disguised as concerned observation. "Margaret, please, not now," I said quietly, hoping to avoid a scene in front of Dr. Henley. "Mabel is very sick, and I need to focus on getting her the treatment she needs." But Margaret was just getting started. She positioned herself directly in front of me, her pale blue eyes scanning the situation with the calculating precision of a prosecutor building a case. Her gaze moved from my tear-stained face to Mabel's limp form, and I watched as her expression shifted from apparent concern to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Sick?" Margaret's voice rose with theatrical shock. "Elena, this is exactly what I've been trying to tell David for months. You're simply not responsible enough to care for a living creature. Look at this poor animal suffering because of your negligence." Dr. Henley stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret replied crisply, extending a manicured hand that bore her late husband's family ring. Margaret Whitmore. I'm Elena's mother-in-law, and I've been concerned about her pet care for quite some time. This cat has been declining for weeks, but Elena refuses to listen to advice or take proper precautions. My mouth fell open in shock. That's not true, I protested, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Mabel has been perfectly healthy. She had her annual checkup just 2 months ago, and Dr. Peterson said she was in excellent condition. Margaret turned to Dr. Henley with the expression of a long-suffering family member dealing with a difficult relative. Doctor, you have to understand, Elena has always been unreliable when it comes to responsibility. She works these odd hours as a freelance graphic designer, stays up all night, sleeps until noon. The poor cat's feeding schedule has been completely erratic. I've seen her leave food out for days at a time. That's completely false, I said, my voice gaining strength as the injustice of her accusations sank in. I have a strict feeding schedule for Mabel. I measure her food precisely, and I would never leave food out that could spoil or harm her. But Margaret was building momentum, her voice taking on the practiced rhythm of someone accustomed to controlling narratives and managing perceptions. Just yesterday, when I stopped by to check on them, I found this cat eating something off the floor that Elena had obviously spilled and forgotten to clean up. I warned her that cats will eat anything if you don't supervise them properly, but she just dismissed my concerns like she always does. Dr. Henley looked between us with growing discomfort, clearly wishing she could focus on treating her patient rather than mediating a family dispute. Ladies, right now my priority is stabilizing Mabel and determining exactly what caused her condition. We can discuss care protocols once we have more information. Of course, doctor, Margaret said, her tone becoming warm and cooperative. I completely understand your position. But I think it's important you know the context of this situation. Elena has a pattern of carelessness, and I'm afraid this poor animal is paying the price for it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I felt tears of frustration and helplessness welling up in my eyes. This was exactly how every interaction with Margaret played out. She would create a narrative that cast me as incompetent or irresponsible, present herself as the voice of reason and experience, and systematically undermine my credibility, until I looked like exactly the kind of person who would neglect a beloved pet. The blood work will show us exactly what substance caused this reaction, Dr. Henley said firmly, clearly attempting to end the speculation. Until then, I suggest we focus on treatment rather than blame. Margaret's expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I caught something in her eyes that looked almost like panic. But it was gone so quickly that I convinced myself I had imagined it. Of course, you're absolutely right, doctor. I'm just upset seeing this poor creature suffer unnecessarily. As Dr. Henley prepared to take Mabel to the treatment area, Margaret moved closer to me, her voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. This is what happens when you refuse to listen to people who know better than you do, Elena. Maybe now you'll finally understand that actions have consequences. I stared at her in disbelief. Even in this moment of crisis, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. There was something in her tone, something beyond mere disapproval or criticism. There was a certainty, an almost smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Chen. Dr. Henley called from the treatment room doorway. You can kiss Mabel goodbye for now, but then I need you to wait in the reception area while we work on her. The next few hours will be critical. I pressed my lips to the soft fur on top of Mabel's head, breathing in her familiar scent one more time. Please fight, baby girl, I whispered. I love you so much. Please don't leave me. As Dr. Henley carried Mabel away, I felt as though a piece of my heart was being torn from my chest. Mabel had been my constant companion through the loneliest years of my life. She had curled up beside me during graduate school all-nighters, comforted me through the death of my parents in a car accident 2 years earlier, and been the one living being who offered unconditional love during the increasingly difficult dynamics of my marriage. Margaret followed me to the reception area, settling into a chair with the air of someone preparing for a long vigil. She pulled out her phone and began making calls, her voice carrying across the quiet waiting room as she updated various family members on the crisis Elena had created. "Yes, David, I'm at the emergency vet clinic with your wife," she said into the phone, her tone suggesting she was the responsible adult handling a situation created by someone else's incompetence. "The cat is very sick, and I'm afraid Elena's lack of proper care has finally caught up with her. I've been trying to warn her for months that this would happen." I sat in stunned silence, listening to Margaret rewrite the narrative in real time. According to her version of events, she had been the concerned family member trying to prevent exactly this situation, while I had been the stubborn, irresponsible pet owner who refused to listen to good advice. The waiting room phone rang, and the receptionist answered with professional courtesy. "Riverside Emergency Veterinary Clinic. How can I help you?" After a brief conversation, she hung up and approached me. "Miss Chen, Dr. Henley wanted me to let you know that Mabel is stable for now, but she's going to need intensive treatment for at least the next 24 hours. The blood work should be back sometime tomorrow, and that will help determine the best course of treatment going forward." Relief flooded through me at the news that Mabel was stable, but the mention of blood work and toxicology results brought back the reality of what we were facing. Someone or something had poisoned my cat, and I had no idea how it had happened. Margaret ended her phone call and turned to me with an expression of manufactured sympathy. "Elena, I know this is difficult for you, but I think we need to have an honest conversation about what led to this situation." "I don't understand what you mean," I said, though part of me dreaded where this conversation was heading. "Darling, I've been watching you struggle with basic responsibilities since you married my son," Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone of a patient teacher explaining something to a slow student. "You work irregular hours, you forget appointments, you leave things half-finished around the house. David has mentioned how worried he is about your ability to manage even simple tasks." I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation. "That's not fair, Margaret. I run my own business successfully, I manage our household finances, and I take excellent care of Mabel. David has never expressed any concerns about my responsibilities to me directly." Margaret's smile was cold and knowing. "Oh, sweet Elena, do you really think David would hurt your feelings by being completely honest about his concerns? He's trying to be supportive, but privately he's told me how worried he is about your increasing forgetfulness and carelessness." The words hit me like individual daggers. David had been discussing me with his mother behind my back, sharing supposed concerns that he had never once mentioned to me directly. I thought about our recent conversations, searching for any indication that he was unhappy with my performance as a wife or pet owner, but I could find nothing that supported Margaret's claims. "I don't believe that," I said quietly, but even as I spoke the words, doubt began creeping in. David had been working longer hours recently, and he had seemed distracted and distant during our conversations. I had attributed it to stress from his job as a corporate attorney, but now I wondered if there were other factors I hadn't considered. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more intimate and confidential. "Elena, I'm telling you this because I care about you and because I want to help. This situation with Mabel could have been prevented if you had been more attentive to the warning signs. The poor animal was obviously getting into something toxic, but you were too distracted with your work projects to notice." "But I did notice," I protested. "Mabel was acting completely normal until this morning. She ate her breakfast, played with her feather toy, and was sleeping in her usual spot on the windowsill when I left for my morning run. When I came back an hour later, I found her having seizures on the kitchen floor." Margaret's expression became pitying, as though she was dealing with someone who was clearly delusional. "Honey, cats are very good at hiding illness and distress. The fact that you didn't notice the subtle signs just proves my point about your lack of attention to detail." I wanted to argue further, but exhaustion and emotional strain were taking their toll. Margaret had a way of presenting her criticisms that made them sound like concerned observations rather than attacks. She could systematically dismantle my confidence and credibility while maintaining the appearance of being helpful and supportive. The reception area grew quiet as other pet owners came and went, dealing with their own emergencies and concerns. I watched them interact with the staff and with each other, noting the genuine worry and love they showed for their animals. None of them were being lectured by family members about their inadequacy as pet owners. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Mom told me about Mabel. Sorry I couldn't leave work to come with you. We'll call when I get out of this meeting. Hope she's okay." I stared at the message, trying to read between the lines for any indication of the concerns Margaret claimed he had shared with her. The text seemed genuinely caring but brief, which was typical of David's communication style when he was busy with work. Nothing in his words suggested he blamed me for Mabel's condition or viewed me as an irresponsible pet owner. But Margaret's seeds of doubt had been planted, and I found myself questioning everything. Had I missed subtle signs of illness in Mabel? Had I been so focused on my design projects that I hadn't paid proper attention to her needs? Was I really as careless and irresponsible as Margaret suggested? The emergency clinic's atmosphere was sterile and tense, filled with the worried energy of people facing medical crises with their beloved animals. I watched other pet owners pace the waiting room or sit in anxious silence, and I realized that most of them were alone with their worry. They didn't have family members providing running commentary on their failures as caregivers. "Elena?" Margaret said, interrupting my thoughts. "I want you to know that David and I have discussed what would be best for everyone if Mabel doesn't recover from this." The words sent a chill through my entire body. "What do you mean?" "Well, darling, you have to face the possibility that this might be the end for her. And if that happens, I think it would be wise to take some time to really evaluate whether pet ownership is right for you at this stage of your life." I stared at Margaret in disbelief. Mabel wasn't even gone, and she was already planning my future without her. "Margaret, Mabel is going to recover. Dr. Henley said she's stable." "I hope you're right," Margaret replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "But if she doesn't, I think it would be a mistake to immediately get another pet. You need to focus on your marriage and on developing better organizational skills before taking on that kind of responsibility again." The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. She was using Mabel's crisis as an opportunity to restructure my entire life according to her preferences. In her vision of the future, I would be pet-free and presumably more available to cater to her son's needs and her own expectations for what a proper daughter-in-law should be. "I'm not having this conversation right now," I said firmly, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Mabel is going to be fine, and she's staying with me no matter what you think about my capabilities as a pet owner." Margaret's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of irritation at my unexpected resistance. "Elena, I understand you're emotional right now, but you need to start thinking practically about these situations. David's career is at a critical stage, and he needs a wife who can support him without creating additional stress and drama." The implication was clear. My presence in David's life was already problematic, and Mabel's illness was just further evidence of my inability to manage adult responsibilities. According to Margaret's logic, the best thing I could do for everyone would be to eliminate the sources of chaos in my life and focus entirely on being the kind of wife who never created problems or required attention. But as I sat in that sterile waiting room, listening to Margaret's plans for my future, something inside me began to shift. The grief and fear I felt for Mabel was real and overwhelming, but underneath it a small flame of anger was beginning to burn. There was something wrong with this entire situation, something that went beyond a sick cat and a difficult mother-in-law. Margaret's certainty about what had happened to Mabel bothered me. Her immediate assumption that I was to blame, her detailed theories about my negligence, and her readiness with solutions and consequences all felt too prepared. Too convenient. It was as though she had been waiting for exactly this type of crisis to prove her point about my inadequacy. And there was something else, something in her eyes when Dr. Henley mentioned the toxicology report. Just for a moment, Margaret's confident facade had cracked, revealing what looked like genuine concern about what those test results might reveal. But if Mabel had been poisoned by my carelessness, why would Margaret be worried about evidence that would prove her right? As the hours passed and we continued our vigil in the waiting room, I found myself studying Margaret's behavior more carefully. She made frequent trips to the restroom, each time taking her purse with her and returning looking slightly more composed. She checked her phone obsessively, deleted messages after reading them, and seemed increasingly agitated despite her attempts to maintain her authoritative demeanor. When Dr. Henley finally emerged from the treatment area near midnight, both Margaret and I jumped to our feet. The veterinarian looked tired but cautiously optimistic as she approached us with an update on Mabel's condition. "She's responding well to the supportive care," Dr. Henley reported. "We've managed to stabilize her vital signs, and she's showing signs of neurological improvement. We're going to keep her overnight for continued monitoring, but I'm cautiously hopeful about her prognosis." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I felt my knees buckle. "Thank you," I whispered, tears of gratitude streaming down my face. "Thank you so much." Quote, "The blood work and toxicology screen should be completed by tomorrow afternoon," Dr. Henley continued. "Once we know exactly what substance caused her symptoms, we'll have a better idea of potential long-term effects and the best course of ongoing treatment." Margaret stepped forward, her professional smile back in place. "Doctor, will those test results help determine how this happened? Will you be able to tell if it was something Elena left accessible to the cat?" Dr. Henley nodded slowly. "The toxicology report will identify the specific substance and approximate quantity ingested. Depending on what we find, we may be able to determine the likely source and method of exposure." "Good," Margaret said with satisfaction. "I think that information will be very helpful for everyone involved." As we finally left the emergency clinic in the early hours of the morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret seemed less relieved about Mabel's improvement than she appeared concerned about the upcoming test results. Her behavior throughout the evening had been strange and calculating, even by her usual standards. But I was too exhausted and emotionally drained to analyze her motivations further. All that mattered was that Mabel was alive and fighting. Tomorrow I would get answers about what had happened to her, and then I could focus on bringing her home and making sure she recovered completely. I had no way of knowing that those toxicology results would reveal far more than just what had poisoned my cat. They would uncover a web of deception and manipulation that went to the very heart of my marriage and my identity. The woman who had spent 3 years systematically undermining my confidence and credibility was about to have her own secrets exposed in the most devastating way possible. But for now, driving home through the empty streets with Margaret's continued commentary about my failures as background noise, I simply held on to the hope that tomorrow would bring answers, and the beginning of Mabel's recovery. I couldn't imagine that those same answers would also mark the beginning of my own transformation from victim to survivor, and ultimately to someone strong enough to help others facing similar battles. The emergency clinic had been just the beginning. The real story was about to unfold when Dr. Henley called with those test results, and Margaret's carefully constructed world of lies would finally begin to crumble. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of our downtown Seattle apartment as I sat at my desk, surrounded by the familiar chaos of my freelance graphic design business. Color swatches were scattered across every available surface. Client sketches covered the wall behind my computer monitor, and 3 different coffee cups sat at various stages of emptiness around my workspace. This was my sanctuary, the place where I felt most competent and in control of my professional life. Mabel had recovered from her mysterious illness 6 weeks earlier, though the veterinary bills had strained our already tight budget. The toxicology report had identified a rare plant toxin, but Dr. Henley had been unable to determine the exact source of exposure. Margaret had used this uncertainty to reinforce her narrative about my carelessness, suggesting that I must have brought some unknown toxic substance into the apartment without realizing it. David had accepted his mother's explanation without question, and our conversations about the incident had grown increasingly tense. He never directly accused me of negligence, but his increased attention to household details and his frequent questions about Mabel's daily routine made his doubts clear. The trust that had once existed between us had been replaced by a careful politeness that left me feeling like a tenant rather than a wife. I turned my attention back to the logo design I was creating for a small nonprofit organization that worked with domestic violence survivors. The irony was not lost on me that while I helped other women find their voice and rebuild their identities, I was gradually losing my own in the slow erosion of my marriage. Each day brought small compromises and accommodations that seemed reasonable individually but had accumulated into a significant shift in the balance of power in our relationship. The phone rang, interrupting my concentration. Margaret's name appeared on the caller ID, and I felt the familiar tightening in my stomach that accompanied all our interactions. Since Mabel's illness, Margaret had increased the frequency of her check-ins, calling at least twice a week to inquire about household management and pet care, with the persistent concern of someone monitoring a recovering addict. "Good morning, Margaret," I answered, keeping my voice neutral and professional. "Elena, darling, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Margaret's voice carried its usual undertone of skepticism about the value of my work. "I wanted to check on how things are going with Mabel and see if you need any advice about proper pet care routines." The question stung because it implied that my previous care had been inadequate and that Margaret possessed superior knowledge about animal welfare. In reality, Margaret had never owned pets and frequently expressed distaste for animals in general. Her sudden expertise in feline health had emerged only after Mabel's illness provided her with ammunition against my competence. "Mabel is doing wonderfully," I replied, watching my cat stretch lazily in her favorite patch of morning sunlight. "She's back to her normal routine, eating well, and her energy levels are completely restored." Dr. Peterson confirmed at her follow-up appointment that she shows no lingering effects from the poisoning. "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she found the outcome somewhat disappointing. "I suppose Dr. Peterson still has no theories about how such a thing could happen to a well-cared-for indoor cat." The emphasis on well-cared-for made it clear that Margaret continued to question whether Mabel had truly received proper care. Every conversation about the incident followed the same pattern, with Margaret expressing relief about Mabel's recovery while simultaneously reinforcing doubts about my role in preventing the crisis. Dr. Peterson said that poisoning cases can be very mysterious. I replied carefully. "Sometimes the source is never identified, especially when the symptoms develop quickly and the exposure was limited." Margaret's skeptical hum carried clearly through the phone. "Well, I suppose these things happen when people aren't paying close attention to potential hazards. I've been reading about pet safety, and there are so many common household items that can be toxic to cats. It's quite overwhelming for someone without experience." The implication was clear. Despite having successfully cared for Mabel for 8 years, Margaret considered me inexperienced and prone to dangerous oversights. She had positioned herself as the knowledgeable family member, providing guidance to someone who had already proven her incompetence through Mabel's illness. "I appreciate your concern," I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. "But I've been researching pet safety for years, and I'm very careful about what I bring into the apartment." "Of course you are, dear." Margaret's patronizing tone made my jaw clench. "But sometimes we think we're being careful when we're actually missing important details. That's why it's so valuable to have someone with outside perspective helping you identify potential problems." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret offering unsolicited advice about everything from litter box placement to feeding schedules. Each suggestion was presented as helpful guidance, but the underlying message was that I required constant supervision and correction to prevent future disasters. After hanging up, I found myself questioning decisions I had made confidently for years. Did Mabel's food bowl need to be moved to a different location? Was her litter box properly ventilated? Had I been overlooking obvious safety hazards that a more experienced pet owner would have identified immediately? This internal interrogation had become a regular part of my daily routine. Margaret's persistent undermining of my judgment had created a state of constant self-doubt that extended far beyond pet care into every aspect of my life. I second-guessed my professional decisions, analyzed my social interactions for hidden failures, and scrutinized my household management for evidence of the incompetence Margaret insisted on highlighting. The apartment that had once felt like a comfortable home now felt like a stage where my performance was constantly being evaluated. I moved through daily tasks with hypervigilant attention to potential mistakes, knowing that any oversight would be seized upon as evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. David's work schedule had become increasingly demanding, with frequent evening meetings and weekend conferences that kept him away from home. When he was present, our conversations remained surface level and polite, avoiding topics that might lead to conflict or uncomfortable questions about our relationship dynamics. He had stopped asking about my work projects, which had once been a source of connection and shared enthusiasm. The creative challenges and client successes that energized my professional life no longer seemed to interest him, and my attempts to share exciting developments were met with distracted acknowledgments and quick subject changes. Our physical intimacy had also diminished significantly. The spontaneous affection and playful interactions that had characterized our early relationship had been replaced by scheduled obligations and perfunctory gestures. David's kisses goodbye in the morning felt automatic rather than affectionate, and our bedtime routines had become parallel activities rather than shared experiences. I told myself that these changes were temporary, that the stress of his expanding legal practice and the lingering tension from Mabel's illness would eventually resolve into renewed closeness. But privately, I worried that we were drifting apart in ways that might be irreversible. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of my current situation. Margaret's campaign of subtle undermining had made me hesitant to share my concerns with friends or family. How could I explain that my mother-in-law's apparent helpfulness felt like an attack? How could I articulate that her concerned questions about my competence were slowly destroying my confidence without sounding paranoid or ungrateful? My college friend Sarah had noticed changes in my demeanor during our recent lunch meeting. She commented that I seemed less confident and more anxious than usual, asking if everything was okay at home. I had deflected her questions with vague references to work stress and adjustment challenges in marriage, but her concern had lingered in my mind. The truth was that I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. The decisive, creative woman who had built a successful freelance business and maintained an 8-year relationship with a beloved pet was being gradually replaced by someone who questioned every decision and sought external validation for basic life choices. Margaret's influence extended beyond our direct interactions, through the changes in David's behavior and expectations. He had begun making comments about household organization that echoed his mother's concerns, suggesting improvements in systems that had worked effectively for years. His requests were always reasonable individually, but collectively they represented a systematic restructuring of our home life according to Margaret's preferences. The kitchen had been reorganized according to Margaret's suggestions about proper food storage and preparation areas. Our social calendar increasingly reflected Margaret's opinions about appropriate activities and social connections. Even our financial decisions were being influenced by her advice about responsible spending and investment priorities. I found myself implementing these changes without significant resistance, partly because they were presented as improvements rather than criticisms, and partly because the alternative was constant conflict with both Margaret and David. The path of least resistance led steadily away from my own preferences and toward a lifestyle that satisfied Margaret's vision of proper domestic management. My professional work remained the one area where I maintained some sense of autonomy and competence. Clients appreciated my creative solutions and reliable project management, providing external validation that countered Margaret's persistent implications about my inadequacy. But even this sanctuary was being gradually eroded by scheduling pressures and the emotional exhaustion that resulted from constant vigilance in my personal life. The nonprofit logo project had become particularly meaningful to me because it represented women who had successfully escaped controlling relationships and rebuilt their lives on their own terms. As I refined the design elements, I found myself thinking about their courage and determination. They had recognized unhealthy patterns in their relationships and taken decisive action to protect themselves, even when it meant leaving behind familiar security for uncertain independence. Their stories resonated with me in ways that made me uncomfortable. Was my own relationship showing signs of the subtle control and manipulation that characterized the experiences of these survivors? Margaret's behavior certainly fit patterns of psychological manipulation, but David's participation seemed more passive than actively abusive. I dismissed these comparisons as dramatic overreaction to normal family tensions. Every marriage required compromise and adjustment, especially when dealing with complex family dynamics. Margaret's involvement in our relationship might be excessive, but it wasn't necessarily pathological. David's increased distance might reflect work stress rather than fundamental changes in his feelings toward me. But these rational explanations couldn't completely silence the growing sense that something essential was being lost in the daily accommodations and small surrenders that characterized my current life. The woman who had once felt confident in her judgment and secure in her relationships was being replaced by someone who constantly sought permission and validation for basic decisions. The afternoon brought a knock at the door that interrupted my design work. Margaret stood in the hallway holding a large shopping bag and wearing the bright smile that typically preceded her most intrusive interventions in my domestic life. "Surprise, Elena," she announced, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I've brought some things that will help you maintain better organization and safety protocols for Mabel." The shopping bag contained an array of pet care products that Margaret had selected based on her recent research into proper feline health management. There were new food storage containers, specialized cleaning products, and several books about responsible pet ownership. Each item came with detailed explanations about why my current approach was inadequate and how these improvements would prevent future health crises. "This is really thoughtful, Margaret," I said, though the gifts felt more like corrections than kindnesses. "But I'm already satisfied with Mabel's current care routine, and Dr. Peterson hasn't recommended any changes to her management." Margaret's smile tightened slightly at my resistance to her helpful suggestions. "Elena, I understand that criticism can be difficult to accept, but sometimes we need outside perspective to identify areas for improvement. These products represent current best practices in pet care, not just my personal opinions." The conversation that followed covered familiar territory, with Margaret presenting detailed arguments about the superiority of her recommendations, while I offered increasingly weak defenses of my current practices. The dynamic was exhausting, because Margaret's position was always presented as objective and research-based, while my preferences were characterized as stubborn attachment to inferior methods. By the time Margaret left 2 hours later, I had agreed to implement most of her suggestions despite my initial resistance. The apartment felt different with the new products prominently displayed, a constant reminder of my supposed inadequacy and Margaret's superior knowledge about proper household management. David arrived home that evening to find me reorganizing Mabel's feeding area according to Margaret's specifications. His approval of the changes was immediate and enthusiastic, confirming that he had discussed these improvements with his mother and supported her intervention in our domestic arrangements. "This looks great, Elena," he said, examining the new storage containers and feeding schedule that Margaret had provided. "Mom really knows her stuff when it comes to organization and planning. I think these changes will make a big difference in keeping Mabel healthy." The implicit criticism stung deeply. David's praise for Margaret's contributions carried the clear implication that my previous care had been inadequate, and that outside intervention had been necessary to ensure Mabel's well-being. His enthusiasm for changes that undermined my competence felt like a betrayal of our partnership and a validation of Margaret's persistent criticism. "I've been keeping Mabel healthy for 8 years without any problems except for that one mysterious incident," I replied, unable to keep defensiveness out of my voice. "I don't understand why we need to completely restructure her care routine based on one unexplained illness." David's expression shifted to the patient tolerance he typically displayed when I expressed resistance to his mother's helpful suggestions. "Elena, I think you're being a little defensive about this. Mom is just trying to help prevent another scare like we had 6 weeks ago. These aren't major changes, just some improvements to make things more efficient and safe." The conversation ended with my reluctant agreement to give the new system a trial period, though privately I resented the implication that my judgment was so poor that Margaret's intervention was necessary for Mabel's basic welfare. The trust and partnership that had once characterized my relationship with David was being systematically replaced by his mother's authority in matters ranging from pet care to household management. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my daily life had changed over the past few months. The confident woman who had once managed her own business, maintained a loving relationship with her pet, and contributed equally to a marriage had been gradually replaced by someone who sought approval for basic decisions and deferred to outside authority on matters where she had previously felt competent. Margaret's patient campaign of undermining had been masterfully executed, creating doubt where there had once been certainty and dependency, where there had once been autonomy. The process had been so gradual and seemingly well-intentioned that I had participated in my own diminishment without recognizing what was happening. But as I lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside me, a small spark of rebellion began to kindle in my chest. The woman I had been before Margaret's influence was still there, buried under layers of accumulated doubt and compromise. The nonprofit logo project had reminded me of my professional capabilities and creative strength. Mabel's complete recovery had proven that my care had been adequate, despite Margaret's implications otherwise. Perhaps it was time to stop accepting Margaret's version of reality and start trusting my own judgment again. The question was whether I had the courage to challenge a dynamic that had become so thoroughly established in my relationship with both Margaret and David. The toxicology report that had supposedly explained Mabel's illness had left many questions unanswered. The rare plant toxin identified in her blood work didn't match any plants in my apartment or accessible areas of the building. Dr. Henley's inability to identify the source of exposure had been troubling at the time, but I had been too focused on Mabel's recovery to pursue the inconsistencies further. Now, as I replayed the events leading up to Mabel's illness, certain details began to stand out with new significance. Margaret's immediate certainty about my culpability, her prepared explanations for how the poisoning must have occurred, and her almost prophetic predictions about the need for improved safety measures all seemed remarkably prescient for someone who had no direct knowledge of the situation. The seeds of suspicion that had been planted during that long night in the emergency veterinary clinic began to germinate into serious questions about Margaret's role in Mabel's illness. But these thoughts seemed too dramatic and paranoid to pursue seriously. Surely no one would deliberately harm an innocent animal just to prove a point about domestic inadequacy. Yet, as I drifted towards sleep, I couldn't shake the growing conviction that the woman who had spent months systematically undermining my confidence and credibility was capable of more serious manipulation than I had previously imagined. The false normal of our current domestic arrangement was built on foundations that might be far more unstable than they appeared. Tomorrow would bring more of the same careful politeness and subtle erosion of my autonomy. But perhaps it would also bring opportunities to reclaim some of the strength and judgment that Margaret had worked so diligently to undermine. The woman I had been was still there, waiting for the right moment to resurface and reclaim her life from those who had benefited from her diminishment. The emergency clinic crisis had been just the beginning of a much larger story about manipulation, control, and the gradual destruction of trust in intimate relationships. But it would also become the catalyst for my eventual recognition that some battles are worth fighting, even when the opponents seem to hold all the advantages, and the stakes involve everything I thought I valued about my life. The morning that changed everything began like countless others in the carefully orchestrated routine that had become my life. The September air carried the first hint of autumn as I prepared Mabel's breakfast according to the precise schedule Margaret had established following the poisoning incident 3 months earlier. Every aspect of pet care had been systematized and documented, transforming what had once been natural interactions into clinical procedures designed to prevent any future accusations of negligence. David had left early for a depositions hearing in Tacoma, kissing my forehead with the distracted affection that had become standard in our marriage. His coffee cup sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, still warm, alongside the scattered papers from a case file he had been reviewing the night before. The familiar chaos of his legal work provided a sharp contrast to the rigid organization Margaret had imposed on every other aspect of our domestic life. I settled at my computer to work on a rebranding project for a small tech startup, grateful for the creative challenges that still allowed me to feel competent and valuable. The morning hours passed quietly, with Mabel curled in her favorite spot on the windowsill, watching pigeons navigate the fire escape outside our third-floor apartment. These peaceful moments had become precious to me, representing brief respites from the constant vigilance that characterized my interactions with Margaret and David. The doorbell rang at exactly 11:30, interrupting my concentration on a particularly complex logo design. Margaret stood in the hallway holding a large potted plant, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the morning drizzle, wearing the bright smile that typically preceded her most significant interventions in my life. "Elena, darling, I have something wonderful for you," she announced, stepping into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I know how much you love having plants around, And I found this gorgeous specimen at the garden center. It will brighten up that corner by the window beautifully." The plant was undeniably beautiful, with broad green leaves that caught the light and delicate white flowers that filled the room with a subtle, sweet fragrance. Margaret positioned it carefully in the corner she had designated, stepping back to admire the effect with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a long-standing decorative problem. "Margaret, this is lovely, but you know I'm always concerned about plant safety with Mabel in the house," I said, approaching the unfamiliar species with caution. "What kind of plant is this? I need to make sure it's not toxic to cats before I can keep it here." Margaret's laugh was light and dismissive, the sound she made when she considered my concerns to be unnecessarily dramatic. "Oh, Elena, you worry too much about these things. This is a completely harmless houseplant. The garden center assured me it's perfectly safe for pets. You can't live in fear of every little possibility." Despite her reassurances, I pulled out my phone to research the plant species, but Margaret quickly moved between me and the plant, her body language becoming subtly defensive. "Really, darling, I wouldn't have brought it if there were any safety concerns. Sometimes you have to trust people who have more experience with these matters." The familiar dynamic asserted itself immediately. Margaret's confident dismissal of my concerns, coupled with her appeal to superior knowledge and experience, created the psychological pressure that typically led to my capitulation. But something about this situation felt different, more urgent than our usual disagreements about household management. "I appreciate the gift, Margaret, but I really need to verify that it's safe before Mabel has access to it," I said firmly, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "It will just take a few minutes to look up the species online." Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her smile becoming slightly strained around the edges. "Elena, I understand that you're still anxious after what happened with Mabel's illness, but you can't let fear control every decision you make. This constant second-guessing shows a lack of trust that's frankly hurtful to people who care about you." The manipulation was expertly executed, reframing my reasonable safety concern as evidence of psychological instability and ingratitude towards someone who had gone out of her way to bring me a thoughtful gift. Margaret's ability to transform any resistance to her wishes into a character flaw in others was one of her most effective tools for maintaining control in relationships. But the stakes felt higher than usual. Mabel's previous poisoning had taught me that mysterious plant toxins could appear in our home through channels I didn't fully understand. The veterinary bills and emotional trauma of that experience made me unwilling to take any risks, regardless of Margaret's assurances about plant safety. "I'm going to move the plant to the balcony until I can research it properly," I said, reaching for the pot, despite Margaret's obvious displeasure. "It's beautiful, and I appreciate the gesture, but I need to be absolutely certain about pet safety." Margaret stepped directly into my path, her friendly demeanor evaporating completely. "Elena, I'm getting very tired of this pattern of behavior. Every kindness is met with suspicion. Every gift is subjected to unnecessary scrutiny. It's becoming impossible to maintain a normal family relationship when you treat every gesture like a potential threat." The confrontation escalated quickly, with Margaret's voice rising to carry the authority she typically reserved for more serious infractions of her expectations. Her criticism expanded beyond the immediate plant issue to encompass broader patterns of behavior that she had been observing with growing concern. "David has mentioned how difficult it's becoming to live with your constant anxiety and paranoia," she continued, her words calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. "He's worried about your mental state, Elena. We both are. This obsessive focus on imaginary dangers is affecting your judgment and your relationships." The mention of David's supposed concerns hit me like a physical blow. The idea that my husband was discussing my mental stability with his mother behind my back created a sense of betrayal that was almost overwhelming. If Margaret's claims were accurate, then the distance I had noticed in our marriage was not the result of work stress but rather David's growing concern about my psychological deterioration. "David has never expressed any concerns about my mental health to me directly," I replied, though doubt was already creeping into my voice. "If he's worried about something, he should discuss it with me, not with you." Margaret's expression became pitying, as though she were dealing with someone who lacked the insight to recognize their own problems. Elena, people don't always share their deepest concerns directly, especially when they're worried about triggering defensive reactions. David loves you, but he's struggling with how to address behaviors that are becoming increasingly irrational. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Margaret systematically dismantling my confidence in my own perceptions and judgments. She presented detailed examples of behaviors that supposedly demonstrated declining mental stability, from my insistence on researching plant safety to my reluctance to accept helpful suggestions about household management. According to Margaret's analysis, my resistance to her guidance represented a pattern of paranoid thinking that was straining my marriage and limiting my ability to function effectively in adult relationships. Her solution involved accepting professional counseling to address these issues before they caused irreparable damage to my family connections. I've already researched some excellent therapists who specialize in anxiety disorders and relationship counseling, Margaret said, pulling a folded paper from her purse. Dr. Rebecca Marsh comes highly recommended, and she has experience helping people work through the kind of trust issues you've been displaying. The pre-prepared referral list revealed the extent to which Margaret had been planning this intervention. She had not arrived with a spontaneous gift and discovered concerning behavior. She had come with a specific agenda designed to pathologize my resistance to her authority and establish professional support for her claims about my deteriorating mental state. But even as Margaret's arguments eroded my confidence, a small part of my mind remained focused on the beautiful plant sitting in the corner. Something about her desperate insistence that I accept it without research felt fundamentally wrong, especially given the mysterious circumstances surrounding Mabel's previous poisoning. I'm willing to consider counseling if that would be helpful, I said carefully, but I'm still going to research this plant before Mabel has access to it. That's just basic responsible pet ownership, not paranoia. Margaret's frustration broke through her controlled demeanor for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine anger that she quickly suppressed. Fine, Elena, waste your time on unnecessary research if it makes you feel better. But I think you'll find that your suspicions are completely unfounded, as usual. She gathered her purse and moved toward the door with the wounded dignity of someone whose generosity had been met with ingratitude. I hope you'll consider what we've discussed today. David deserves a wife who can accept kindness without looking for hidden motives behind every gesture. After Margaret left, I sat staring at the plant with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Her reaction to my desire to research it had been disproportionately intense, suggesting that there was more at stake than simple hurt feelings over my apparent lack of trust. The pre-prepared referral list and her detailed analysis of my supposed psychological problems indicated a level of planning that went far beyond a spontaneous visit with a gift. I opened my laptop and began researching the plant species, starting with general searches for houseplants with white flowers and broad green leaves. The process was complicated by my lack of botanical expertise, but after comparing images and descriptions, I narrowed the possibilities to several related species, all of which shared one disturbing characteristic. Every plant that matched the appearance of Margaret's gift was listed as extremely toxic to cats. The active compounds were described as fast-acting and potentially fatal, causing symptoms that included seizures, respiratory distress, and neurological damage. The clinical description of poisoning symptoms matched exactly what I had observed in Mabel 3 months earlier. My hands trembled as I cross-referenced the plant identification with veterinary toxicology databases. The rare plant toxin that had appeared in Mabel's bloodwork was produced by this exact species. Margaret had not brought me a harmless houseplant as a thoughtful gift. She had brought me the weapon that had been used to poison my cat, disguised as a gesture of generosity and concern. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Margaret had not only orchestrated Mabel's near-fatal poisoning, but she had also used the crisis she created to systematically undermine my confidence and credibility. The months of subtle manipulation, the campaign of concerned criticism, and the gradual erosion of my marriage had all been built on a foundation of deliberate cruelty toward an innocent animal. I photographed the plant from multiple angles, documented my research findings, and began compiling evidence that connected Margaret's gift to Mabel's previous illness. The toxicology report that had seemed mysterious and inconclusive now appeared to tell a clear story about deliberate poisoning by someone with intimate access to our household. But even with this evidence, I faced the daunting challenge of convincing David that his mother was capable of such calculated cruelty. Margaret had spent months positioning me as increasingly unstable and paranoid, creating a narrative framework where any accusations I made against her would appear to be symptoms of deteriorating mental health rather than legitimate concerns about criminal behavior. The plant sat in the corner like a beautiful confession, its delicate white flowers concealing lethal toxins that could have killed Mabel if I had not insisted on researching its safety. Margaret's fury at my refusal to simply trust her judgment now made perfect sense. She had expected me to place the plant where Mabel could access it, creating another poisoning incident that would reinforce her claims about my inadequate pet care, while simultaneously eliminating the witness to her previous crime. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Mom called and mentioned you seemed upset about her gift. Everything okay? The message confirmed that Margaret was already implementing damage control, framing my reaction to her attempted second poisoning as evidence of the mental health issues she had been documenting. Any explanation I offered would be filtered through the narrative she had been carefully constructing over the past months. I stared at the message for a long time, recognizing that my response would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. I could minimize the situation, accept Margaret's characterization of my behavior as paranoid overreaction, and return to the false normal that had been gradually destroying my sense of self. Or I could trust my research, document my evidence, and prepare for a confrontation that would expose Margaret's crimes, while potentially destroying my marriage and social relationships. The choice was not just about a plant or a cat, or even a difficult mother-in-law. It was about whether I would continue to accept other people's definitions of reality when they contradicted my own direct experience and careful research. It was about whether I would allow psychological manipulation to override evidence-based decision-making in matters that affected the safety and well-being of those I loved. I moved the plant to the balcony, where it could no longer pose any risk to Mabel, and began drafting a careful response to David's message. The false normal of our current relationship was built on foundations of deception and manipulation that I could no longer ignore or accommodate. The inciting incident had revealed the true nature of the forces that had been shaping my life, and there was no path back to ignorance or complicity. The plant Margaret brought is extremely toxic to cats, I texted back. I've moved it outside until we can discuss this properly when you get home. The reply was immediate. Are you sure? Mom said the garden center assured her it was pet safe. Margaret's lie was already in place, creating plausible deniability for her attempt to poison Mabel again. But this time I had evidence, research, and the clarity that comes from finally understanding the true nature of a situation that had been deliberately obscured. I've researched the species thoroughly, I responded. This is the same plant that poisoned Mabel 3 months ago. We need to talk. The silence that followed my message stretched for hours, giving me time to compile additional evidence and prepare for the confrontation that would determine whether truth or manipulation would shape the future of my relationships. The woman who had spent months doubting her own perceptions and accepting other people's authority over her lived experience was finally ready to trust her research and defend her findings, regardless of the personal cost. The beautiful plant on the balcony represented more than just another attempt to harm Mabel. It was Margaret's confession, her arrogant assumption that I would never develop the knowledge or confidence necessary to recognize her weapons or challenge her authority. But the months of systematic undermining had also been months of growth, as I learned to research my concerns thoroughly and trust evidence over emotional manipulation. The evening ahead would bring David home to hear my explanation and choose between his wife's documented evidence and his mother's established narrative about my mental instability. But regardless of his decision, I knew that I could no longer live in the false normal that Margaret had constructed through deliberate cruelty and systematic deception. The inciting incident had shattered the illusion of safety and normality that had kept me trapped in relationships built on lies. The woman who had once accepted blame for crimes she didn't commit, and grateful for gifts that contained hidden dangers, was finally ready to trust her own research, protect those she loved, and demand accountability from those who had betrayed that trust. Mabel stretched in her favorite spot by the window, unaware of how close she had come to experiencing another poisoning that would have been blamed on my carelessness and used to justify even more intrusive control over our lives. But this time, Margaret's weapon would become evidence, and her attempt to maintain power through manufactured crisis would instead become the catalyst for exposing the full scope of her deception and cruelty. The false normal was ending, and the real battle for truth and justice was about to begin. The hours following my discovery of the toxic plant stretched endlessly as I sat in the apartment, surrounded by evidence of Margaret's deliberate attempt to harm Mabel once again. The printouts of botanical research lay scattered across my desk alongside photographs of the plant and copies of the veterinary toxicology report from 3 months earlier. The documentation painted a clear picture of calculated cruelty, yet I found myself paralyzed by the magnitude of what confronting this truth would mean for every relationship that mattered to me. David's key turned in the lock at precisely 6:15, the familiar sound that had once brought comfort now filling me with dread. His footsteps approached the living room where I sat surrounded by my research, and I watched his expression shift from tired contentment to confusion as he took in the scene before him. "Elena, what's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie as his gaze moved from the plant documentation to my obviously distressed state. "Your texts today were pretty intense. Are you sure you're not overreacting to Mom's gift?" The question contained the implicit assumption that my concerns were disproportionate, that my research was the product of anxiety rather than legitimate investigation. This automatic dismissal of my documented findings represented the very pattern that had been eroding my confidence for months, and I recognized it now as a fundamental barrier to any meaningful conversation about Margaret's behavior. "David, please sit down and look at this evidence with an open mind," I said carefully, attempting to maintain the calm professional tone I used when presenting design concepts to skeptical clients. "I've spent the entire afternoon researching the plant your mother brought, and the findings are extremely concerning." He settled into the armchair across from me with the patient expression he typically wore when indulging what he considered to be my more dramatic tendencies. This preliminary dismissal made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but I forced myself to proceed with the presentation I had mentally rehearsed throughout the afternoon. "The plant Margaret brought today is Convallaria majalis, commonly known as lily of the valley," I began, showing him the botanical identification materials. "Every reliable source confirms that this species is extremely toxic to cats, containing cardiac glycosides that cause the exact symptoms Mabel experienced during her poisoning 3 months ago." David glanced at the research materials without genuine engagement, his attention focused more on monitoring my emotional state than evaluating the substance of my findings. "Elena, I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for this. Maybe Mom was given incorrect information at the garden center, or maybe you've misidentified the species. These plant identification websites aren't always reliable." His reflexive defense of his mother's innocence dismissed hours of careful research without serious consideration. The automatic assumption that my botanical identification must be incorrect, rather than acknowledging the possibility that Margaret had brought a poisonous plant into our home, revealed the depth of his investment in maintaining the established family narrative. "I've cross-referenced the identification through multiple botanical databases and veterinary toxicology resources," I replied, showing him the printed confirmations from universities and professional medical sources. "The visual characteristics are unmistakable, and the toxic compounds match exactly what appeared in Mabel's blood work." David's expression became increasingly uncomfortable as the weight of evidence made casual dismissal more difficult. "Okay, let's say you're right about the plant identification. That doesn't mean Mom brought it here intentionally to harm Mabel. She's not some evil mastermind plotting against our cat, Elena. She's a 65-year-old woman who made an innocent mistake." The characterization of deliberate poisoning as an innocent mistake demonstrated how thoroughly Margaret's campaign of subtle manipulation had succeeded in establishing her as the reasonable, well-intentioned family member, while positioning me as the source of unnecessary drama and suspicion. David's worldview simply could not accommodate the possibility that his mother was capable of calculated cruelty toward an animal. "David, 3 months ago Mabel was poisoned by this exact plant toxin under mysterious circumstances that nobody could explain," I said, my voice gaining strength as I connected the evidence. "Today, your mother brought this same toxic plant into our home and became extremely upset when I insisted on researching its safety before allowing Mabel access to it. These are not coincidences." His resistance to considering this connection was immediate and visceral. "Elena, listen to yourself. You're suggesting that my mother deliberately poisoned our cat and then brought the murder weapon back to the scene as a house gift. That's not just unlikely, it's completely irrational. The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to make me question the validity of my own careful research and logical conclusions. David's insistence that my evidence-based analysis was irrational represented a fundamental betrayal of our intellectual partnership and a validation of Margaret's characterization of me as increasingly unstable. The evidence speaks for itself, I said quietly, though doubt was already creeping into my voice despite the documentation spread before us. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to look at the research and consider the possibility that we've both been deceived about what happened to Mabel. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where the toxic plant sat safely isolated on the balcony. Even if you're right about the plant being dangerous, which I'm not conceding, there has to be a rational explanation that doesn't involve accusing my mother of animal abuse. Maybe she was given bad information, maybe she forgot to ask about pet safety, maybe she's been carrying around guilt about Mabel's illness and thought bringing a plant would somehow make amends. His desperate search for alternative explanations revealed how threatening my conclusions were to his fundamental understanding of his family relationships. The cognitive dissonance between the evidence I had presented and his lifelong trust in his mother's character created a psychological conflict that he resolved by attacking the credibility of the evidence, rather than questioning his assumptions about Margaret. David, I understand this is difficult to accept, I said, attempting to bridge the growing chasm between us. But we have to consider the possibility that someone we trusted has been deceiving us. The pattern of behavior, the timing of events, and the physical evidence all point to deliberate manipulation that goes far beyond simple mistakes or misunderstandings. His face flushed with anger at my persistent challenge to his mother's innocence. Elena, I'm getting really concerned about this obsessive focus on finding hidden conspiracies and malicious intent in every interaction. This isn't healthy thinking, and it's destroying our ability to maintain normal family relationships. Quote, "The accusation that my evidence-based analysis represented unhealthy thinking was a direct echo of Margaret's characterization of my resistance to her authority as symptoms of mental instability." David's adoption of her psychological assessment of my behavior revealed how thoroughly her narrative had penetrated our marriage, creating an alliance against me that made honest communication about her actions nearly impossible. "I'm not looking for conspiracies," I replied, struggling to maintain composure as the conversation deteriorated into personal attacks on my mental state. "I'm following evidence and asking questions about inconsistencies that put Mabel's life at risk. That's responsible pet ownership, not paranoid thinking." David's response was immediate and cutting. Responsible pet ownership doesn't involve accusing family members of attempted murder based on internet research and coincidental timing. You're seeing connections that don't exist and attributing malicious intent to people who care about us. The systematic dismissal of my research as internet speculation, rather than careful documentation from professional sources, revealed how completely Margaret's version of reality had replaced objective evaluation of evidence in David's mind. Her months of patient groundwork had created a framework where any accusations against her would be viewed as symptoms of my deteriorating mental health rather than legitimate concerns based on factual investigation. I stared at my husband, recognizing that the man who had once respected my intelligence and analytical abilities had been gradually trained to dismiss my conclusions when they threatened his mother's reputation. The partnership we had once shared in evaluating complex problems had been replaced by his automatic defense of Margaret's innocence, regardless of contradicting evidence. "David, I need you to consider the possibility that we've both been manipulated," I said, making one final attempt to reach the rational person I had married. The gradual undermining of my credibility, the systematic creation of doubt about my competence, and now the attempted reintroduction of the poison that nearly killed Mabel. These are not random events. His expression hardened into the cold professional demeanor he used with opposing counsel in difficult negotiations. "Elena, I think you need to step back and evaluate whether your conclusions are based on facts or on anxiety-driven speculation. This obsession with proving Mom is some kind of criminal mastermind is affecting your judgment and our relationship. The conversation had reached an impasse where further argument would only reinforce his conviction that I was experiencing a psychological crisis rather than responding rationally to documented evidence of deliberate harm. Margaret's patient campaign of positioning me as increasingly unstable had created a defensive framework that made David psychologically incapable of considering her guilt, even when presented with clear physical proof. "I'm going to call Mom and ask her about the plant," David announced, pulling out his phone. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation that will put this whole conspiracy theory to rest." I watched in growing despair as he dialed Margaret's number, knowing that she had already prepared her response to my discovery. The conversation would be brief and conclusive, with Margaret expressing hurt bewilderment at my accusations while reaffirming her concern about my declining mental state. David would hang up with his worldview intact, and his mother positioned as the victim of my irrational suspicions. The phone call proceeded exactly as I had predicted. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the speaker as she expressed shock and dismay at my accusations, explaining that the garden center employee had specifically assured her the plant was pet-safe. Her performance was masterful, combining wounded innocence with maternal concern about my increasing instability and paranoid thinking. "David, I'm genuinely worried about Elena's mental health," Margaret's voice trembled with apparent emotion. "These accusations are becoming more extreme and irrational. I think she needs professional help before this affects her ability to function normally." The conversation concluded with David promising to address my concerning behavior and Margaret offering to research therapists who specialized in anxiety disorders and delusional thinking. By the time he hung up, I had been transformed from a wife presenting evidence of criminal behavior into a patient requiring psychiatric intervention. "Elena, Mom is devastated by these accusations," David said, his tone now carrying the gentle firmness typically used with someone experiencing a mental health crisis. "She explained that she was given bad information at the garden center, and she's horrified that she might have accidentally brought something dangerous into our home." Margaret's prepared explanation relied on the same anonymous garden center employee who had supposedly provided incorrect safety information, creating a plausible alternative narrative that preserved her innocence while explaining the presence of the toxic plant. David's immediate acceptance of this story revealed his desperate need to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about his mother's character and behavior. "David, garden centers don't recommend lily of the valley as houseplants precisely because they're so dangerous to pets and children," I said, though I could already see that additional evidence would only reinforce his conviction that I was experiencing delusional thinking. "Any legitimate nursery employee would know that this species is extremely toxic." His response was immediate and decisive. "Elena, I think we need to seriously consider getting you some professional support to work through these trust issues and anxiety patterns. Your interpretations of normal interactions are becoming increasingly distorted, and it's affecting every aspect of our lives." The psychological framework Margaret had carefully constructed was now complete. Any evidence I presented would be filtered through the lens of my supposed mental instability, and any resistance to her authority would be characterized as symptoms requiring professional intervention. David had been trained to see my rational analysis of threatening situations as proof of psychological dysfunction, rather than appropriate protective responses. I looked around the apartment that had once felt like home, recognizing that it had become a stage where my every action was monitored and interpreted, according to Margaret's narrative about my declining competence. The evidence of deliberate poisoning remained scattered across my desk, but it had been rendered meaningless by the more compelling story of a troubled daughter-in-law whose anxiety had progressed to delusional thinking about family members. The choice before me was stark and terrifying. I could accept David's characterization of my evidence-based conclusions as symptoms of mental illness, agree to psychiatric treatment for problems I didn't have, and return to the false normal of our manipulated family dynamic. The alternative was to trust my own research and judgment while facing the complete destruction of my marriage and social relationships. The weight of that decision was crushing. Everything I had built over the past 3 years with David, all the shared plans and mutual dreams, would be sacrificed in pursuit of a truth that might never be accepted or validated by anyone who mattered to me. Margaret's systematic campaign had been so thorough, that she had successfully isolated me from any support system that might confirm the validity of my concerns. I thought about the nonprofit clients I had been working with, women who had recognized patterns of manipulation and control in their relationships, despite being told by everyone around them that they were overreacting or misperceiving normal interactions. Their courage in trusting their own experience over external pressure to maintain destructive relationships had inspired the logo designs I created for their organization. But knowing what I should do and having the strength to do it were entirely different challenges. The prospect of losing David, facing Margaret's inevitable campaign to destroy my reputation, and rebuilding my life without any of the security and connections I had taken for granted felt overwhelming and potentially impossible. Maybe you're right, I heard myself saying, the words emerging from some deep place of exhaustion and surrender. Maybe I have been overreacting to normal situations and seeing problems that don't really exist. David's relief was immediately visible as the tension in his shoulders relaxed and his defensive posture softened. Elena, I'm so glad you're willing to consider that possibility. It shows real self-awareness and courage to acknowledge when our thinking might be getting distorted by stress and anxiety. His praise for my capitulation felt like acid in my veins, but I forced myself to continue the performance of accepting his version of reality over my own documented research. I suppose the plant identification could be wrong, or maybe there are different varieties that look similar but have different toxicity levels. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but David's approval was immediate and enthusiastic. That's exactly right. Plant identification is much more complicated than it appears online, and there's probably a perfectly innocent explanation for any similarities you noticed. As he began to relax into the familiar dynamic where my concerns were gently dismissed and his mother's innocence remained unquestioned, I felt something essential dying inside me. The woman who had spent the afternoon conducting careful research and connecting evidence was being replaced by someone who accepted other people's interpretations of reality, even when they contradicted her own direct observations. I think I should probably put the plant back inside, I said quietly. If Margaret went to the trouble of selecting it as a gift, I should at least give it a chance to brighten up the apartment like she intended. David's smile was warm and relieved as he moved toward the balcony door. I think that's a wonderful idea, Elena. Mom will be so pleased to know that you appreciate the gesture, and Mabel will probably enjoy having some greenery to look at. The casual dismissal of Mabel's safety, based entirely on Margaret's assurances rather than documented evidence about plant toxicity, represented the complete triumph of manipulation over rational analysis. David was prepared to risk our cat's life rather than question his mother's judgment or acknowledge the validity of my research. But as he reached for the door handle, something inside me rebelled against this surrender to willful ignorance. The evidence remained unchanged regardless of how inconvenient it was for family harmony. Mabel's life remained at risk regardless of how much more comfortable it would be to trust Margaret's explanations rather than botanical databases. Actually, David, I think I need to keep researching this more thoroughly before bringing it back inside, I said, my voice stronger than I had expected. Even if there's only a small chance that I'm right about the toxicity, Mabel's safety is worth the extra caution. His expression shifted immediately back to concern and disappointment. Elena, we just agreed that you might be overreacting to normal situations. Are you already backing away from that self-awareness? The psychological pressure was intense, designed to make me choose between maintaining his approval and protecting Mabel from documented dangers. But something fundamental had shifted during our conversation. Margaret's attempt to reintroduce the poison that had nearly killed Mabel represented a line that I could not allow to be crossed, regardless of the personal cost. I'm willing to consider that I might be wrong about many things, I said carefully, but I'm not willing to risk Mabel's life based on anyone's assurances when I have access to professional toxicology resources that contradict those assurances. The refusal of the call to abandon my own judgment was painful but necessary. David's disappointment was immediate and visible, confirming that our relationship had become dependent on my willingness to subordinate my analysis to his mother's authority. But Mabel's safety represented a boundary that I could not compromise, even to preserve a marriage built on such fundamentally unequal terms. The toxic plant would remain on the balcony, and my research would remain valid regardless of how uncomfortable it made family relationships. The woman who had nearly surrendered her judgment to maintain peace was beginning to recognize that some truths were too important to abandon, even when facing complete social isolation as the consequence of maintaining them. The morning following my confrontation with David arrived gray and heavy, with the kind of Seattle drizzle that seems to seep into your bones and settle there permanently. I had spent the night on the living room couch, unable to share a bed with someone who viewed my evidence-based concerns as symptoms of mental illness. The toxic plant remained on the balcony, a beautiful confession that David refused to acknowledge, while Mabel curled safely beside me, unaware of how close she had come to experiencing another deliberate poisoning. My phone buzzed at 7:30 with a text message from Dr. Patricia Henley, the emergency veterinarian who had treated Mabel during her mysterious illness 3 months earlier. The unexpected communication from someone outside my immediate circle of family manipulation felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. I've been thinking about Mabel's case and wondered if you might have time for a brief consultation about some follow-up questions regarding her toxicology results. Would you be available to meet at my office this afternoon?" The timing felt providential, though I hesitated before responding. David's characterization of my research as obsessive and delusional had planted seeds of doubt about whether pursuing additional investigation would confirm his diagnosis of my deteriorating mental state. Perhaps the rational response was to accept his assessment and abandon my concerns about the inconsistencies in Mabel's poisoning case. But Dr. Henley's professional interest in follow-up questions suggested that my concerns might not be as irrational as David and Margaret had insisted. A veterinary professional with expertise in toxicology cases was requesting additional information, which indicated that the official explanations might indeed be incomplete or inadequate. "I would very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss Mabel's case with you," I replied. "What time would be convenient this afternoon?" The response came quickly, scheduling our meeting for 2 o'clock, and including a brief note that Dr. Henley had been reviewing similar cases and wanted to compare patterns with what had happened to Mabel. The mention of similar cases created a flutter of hope that I might not be alone in confronting mysterious pet poisonings with unclear sources. David had already left for work when I prepared to meet with Dr. Henley, leaving behind a note expressing hope that I would spend the day reflecting on our previous evening's conversation and considering professional counseling to address my anxiety issues. The condescending tone of his written communication confirmed that our marriage had fundamentally shifted from partnership to a therapeutic relationship, where he monitored my mental health and provided guidance about reality testing. The veterinary clinic appeared different in daylight than it had during our emergency visit months earlier. The fluorescent lighting that had seemed harsh and clinical during crisis now provided clear illumination for examining documents and discussing complex medical cases. Dr. Henley greeted me in her office, a space filled with continuing education certificates, veterinary journals, and photographs of animals she had treated successfully over her 15-year career. "Elena, thank you for coming in on such short notice," Dr. Henley began, gesturing for me to take the chair across from her desk. "I've been reviewing Mabel's case file, and there are several aspects of her poisoning that have continued to concern me since her recovery." The professional validation that my concerns might be legitimate created an immediate sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. For months, I had been told that my questions about Mabel's illness represented anxiety-driven overthinking rather than reasonable inquiry into suspicious circumstances. "What specific aspects have been troubling you?" I asked, pulling out the folder of documentation I had compiled following Margaret's attempt to introduce the same toxic plant into our apartment. Dr. Henley opened Mabel's medical file and spread the toxicology results across her desk. "The plant toxin we identified in Mabel's blood work is extremely rare in accidental poisoning cases involving indoor cats. Convallaria majalis contains cardiac glycosides that are highly concentrated and fast-acting, but the plant itself is not commonly found in household environments or typical garden settings. The confirmation that the toxin was unusual rather than a common source of accidental pet poisoning validated my suspicions about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Mabel's illness." Dr. Henley's professional assessment contradicted Margaret and David's assertions that such poisonings were routine occurrences that resulted from normal pet owner carelessness. Additionally, Dr. Henley continued, the concentration of toxins in Mabel's blood work suggested a single, significant exposure rather than gradual ingestion over time. This pattern is more consistent with deliberate administration than with a cat nibbling on accessible plant material. The clinical assessment of deliberate administration sent a chill through my entire body. A veterinary professional with expertise in toxicology was confirming that Mabel's poisoning had characteristics more consistent with intentional harm than accidental exposure. Margaret's crime was not just a theory based on circumstantial evidence. It was a medical conclusion supported by laboratory analysis. Dr. Henley, I need to show you something that might be relevant to your concerns, I said, opening my folder and displaying the botanical identification materials I had compiled. Yesterday, someone brought this plant into my apartment as a gift, and my research indicates it's the same species that poisoned Mabel. Dr. Henley examined the photographs and botanical documentation with the focused attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence objectively. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she cross-referenced my plant identification with the toxicology results from Mabel's medical file. Elena, this is extremely concerning, she said after several minutes of careful review. You're absolutely correct that this is Convallaria majalis, and the person who brought this plant into your home either has no knowledge of basic plant safety or intended to create another poisoning incident. The professional confirmation that Margaret's gift represented either gross negligence or deliberate malice provided the external validation I had been desperately seeking. Dr. Henley's expertise in veterinary toxicology carried the authority that my own research lacked in David's assessment of the situation. There's something else I need to share with you, Dr. Henley continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Over the past year, I've treated 3 other cases of mysterious plant poisoning in cats, all involving the same rare toxin and all presenting similar patterns of deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. The revelation that Mabel's case was not isolated but part of a pattern of similar poisonings expanded the scope of the problem far beyond my personal situation with Margaret. Other cats had been deliberately poisoned using the same method, which suggested either a serial animal abuser or multiple individuals using similar techniques. In each case, Dr. Henley explained, the cat recovered with aggressive treatment, but the source of exposure was never satisfactorily explained. The owners were all conscientious pet parents who maintained safe household environments, yet somehow their indoor cats were exposed to significant quantities of this rare plant toxin. The pattern Dr. Henley described matched exactly what had happened with Mabel. Responsible pet owners, mysterious exposure, inadequate explanations for how indoor cats could access rare toxic plants, and recovery through professional veterinary intervention. The similarities were too significant to represent coincidental accidents. Dr. Henley, in these other cases, were the cat owners dealing with difficult family relationships or people who might have had access to their homes? I asked, beginning to understand that Margaret's behavior might represent a broader pattern of using pet poisoning as a weapon against targeted individuals. Her expression grew thoughtful as she considered the question. Now that you mention it, 2 of the owners did mention ongoing conflicts with family members who would question their pet care competence. In both cases, the poisoning incidents were used as evidence that the owners were neglectful or irresponsible. The revelation that other victims had experienced similar patterns of family manipulation following mysterious pet poisonings confirmed that Mabel's case was not an isolated incident, but part of a calculated strategy for undermining targeted individuals. The method was sophisticated and cruel, using beloved pets as weapons, while simultaneously destroying the owner's credibility and support systems. Elena, I think we need to consider the possibility that these poisonings are connected and intentional, Dr. Henley said, her professional demeanor becoming more grave. The pattern suggests someone with knowledge of veterinary toxicology, who is using pet poisoning as a form of psychological warfare against specific targets. The clinical assessment of psychological warfare validated my growing understanding that Margaret's behavior represented far more than typical family conflict or generational differences about household management. She was engaged in a systematic campaign designed to destroy my mental health and social relationships, while using Mabel's suffering as both weapon and justification. What would you recommend as the next step? I asked, feeling simultaneously relieved to have professional support and terrified about the implications of pursuing formal investigation into Margaret's crimes. Dr. Henley leaned back in her chair, clearly weighing the professional and legal implications of the patterns we had identified. First, I think we need to document everything thoroughly and consider reporting these cases to animal control and possibly law enforcement. Second, I want to connect you with Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinary toxicologist at the University of Washington who specializes in intentional animal poisoning cases. The mention of involving official authorities created a flutter of anxiety about the potential consequences for my already fragile family relationships. David's reaction to Margaret being investigated for animal abuse would likely be explosive, and Margaret herself would certainly launch an aggressive counterattack designed to discredit me and protect her reputation. I understand this is a difficult situation, Dr. Henley continued, reading my hesitation accurately. But these patterns suggest ongoing danger to multiple animals and their owners. The psychological impact on victims who are being systematically undermined while their pets are used as weapons is significant and should not be minimized. Her professional assessment that the psychological manipulation was as serious as the physical harm to the animals provided validation for the emotional trauma I had been experiencing. The months of questioning my own judgment and accepting blame for crimes I didn't commit had been recognized by a medical professional as legitimate harm requiring intervention. Dr. Henley, my husband believes that my concerns about the plant poisoning represent anxiety-driven paranoia rather than reasonable investigation into suspicious circumstances. I admitted, feeling embarrassed about the lack of support in my immediate family. He suggested that I need psychiatric treatment for delusional thinking about family members. Her expression immediately became more serious and concerned. Elena, what you've shown me today represents careful research and evidence-based analysis of genuinely suspicious circumstances. Your conclusions about deliberate poisoning are supported by medical evidence and fit established patterns of intentional animal abuse. This is not delusional thinking. The professional assessment that my analysis was reasonable and evidence-based rather than symptomatic of mental illness provided desperately needed validation. Dr. Henley's expertise in veterinary medicine gave her opinion more weight than David's assumptions about my psychological state. The fact that family members are dismissing documented evidence and characterizing your rational concerns as mental illness is itself concerning, she continued. This type of gaslighting often accompanies systematic abuse and is designed to isolate victims from support systems while discrediting their ability to report harmful behavior. The clinical term gaslighting applied to David and Margaret's treatment of my evidence-based conclusions provided a framework for understanding the psychological manipulation I had been experiencing. My reality testing was not impaired. My reality was being systematically distorted by people who benefited from my confusion and self-doubt. I want to give you some resources for people dealing with family manipulation and systematic abuse, Dr. Henley said, reaching into her desk drawer and pulling out several pamphlets. These organizations specialize in helping individuals who are being undermined and isolated by family members, while their concerns are dismissed as mental health issues. The pamphlets included information about psychological abuse, family manipulation tactics, and support groups for individuals dealing with relatives who used systematic undermining as a control mechanism. The existence of these resources indicated that my situation was not unique, but part of recognized patterns of abuse that required specialized intervention. Dr. Chen, the toxicologist I mentioned, has experience testifying in court cases involving intentional animal poisoning, Dr. Henley explained. She can provide expert analysis of the evidence and help determine whether formal charges should be filed against whoever is responsible for these poisoning incidents. The possibility of expert testimony and formal charges created both hope and terror. Margaret could face criminal prosecution for animal abuse, but the legal process would certainly destroy any remaining pretense of family harmony and might result in complete social isolation if David chose to support his mother over documented evidence. I also want to connect you with Lisa Rodriguez, a counselor who specializes in helping people recover from systematic manipulation by family members, Dr. Henley continued. She understands the unique challenges faced by individuals whose reality has been distorted through gaslighting and whose support systems have been compromised by manipulative relatives. The offer of specialized counseling for manipulation recovery, rather than the psychiatric treatment David had suggested, represented a fundamental difference in understanding my situation. Dr. Henley recognized me as someone who needed support for dealing with abuse rather than someone who required treatment for creating imaginary problems. Elena, I want you to understand that what you're experiencing is not uncommon, Dr. Henley said, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern. Family members who engage in systematic manipulation often use beloved pets as weapons, because the emotional impact is devastating, while the behavior can be disguised as accidents or normal family conflict. The validation that my experience fit established patterns of abuse provided both relief and sadness. Relief that I was not losing my mind or creating drama from normal family interactions, but sadness that what I was experiencing was common enough to be recognized and cataloged by professionals. The recovery process from this type of systematic manipulation takes time and often requires significant changes in family relationships, she continued. But people do recover their confidence and judgment, and they often become advocates for others facing similar situations. The mention of eventual advocacy work resonated with my professional involvement in helping domestic violence survivors rebuild their identities and reclaim their voices. Perhaps my own experience with family manipulation could eventually become a source of strength and wisdom for helping others navigate similar challenges. Dr. Henley, thank you for taking my concerns seriously and providing professional perspective on what I've been experiencing, I said, feeling more hopeful than I had in months. I was beginning to doubt my own ability to evaluate evidence and make rational decisions about basic safety issues. Her smile was both professional and genuinely warm. Elena, your analysis of this situation has been thorough and accurate. Trust your research, document everything, and don't let anyone convince you that evidence-based conclusions represent mental health problems. As I left Drive Henley's office with my folder of documentation and new resources for dealing with systematic manipulation, I felt as though I had been handed tools for fighting a battle I had not even recognized I was engaged in. The mentor had appeared at precisely the moment when I needed professional validation and practical guidance for moving forward. The toxic plant remained on my balcony, but it was no longer just evidence of Margaret's attempted crime. It had become proof that my analytical abilities were intact, that my concerns were justified, and that the systematic undermining I had been experiencing was a recognized form of abuse, requiring specialized intervention rather than psychiatric treatment. The woman who had entered Dr. Henley's office questioning her own sanity and judgment was leaving with professional confirmation that her evidence-based analysis was accurate and her concerns were legitimate. The mentor had provided not just validation, but practical tools and professional connections that would support the journey toward exposing Margaret's crimes and recovering from months of systematic manipulation. The path ahead remained difficult and uncertain, but I was no longer walking it alone or questioning whether the destination was worth the effort. Dr. Henley had provided the professional foundation and specialized resources that would support whatever challenges lay ahead in the battle to protect Mabel and reclaim my own sense of reality from those who had systematically distorted it for their own purposes. The evening following my meeting with Dr. Henley arrived with the weight of an irreversible decision pressing against my consciousness. The resources she had provided lay spread across my desk alongside the botanical evidence and veterinary documentation that had started this journey toward uncomfortable truth. The business card for Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinary toxicologist at the University of Washington, seemed to pulse with potential energy, representing a path toward professional investigation that would make retreat impossible. David returned home at his usual time, carrying Chinese takeout and wearing the cautiously optimistic expression of someone hoping that a troubled family member had spent the day reconsidering their irrational behavior. His greeting was warm but careful, testing the emotional temperature of our apartment to determine whether the previous evening's conflict had resolved itself through my recognition of anxiety-driven overreaction. "How was your day, Elena?" he asked, setting containers of food on our dining table, while maintaining the gentle tone typically reserved for someone recovering from a psychological crisis. "I hope you had some time to think about our conversation and maybe consider whether professional counseling might be helpful," the assumption that my day would naturally be spent in self-reflection and preparation for psychiatric treatment, revealed how thoroughly David had accepted Margaret's characterization of me as someone whose judgment could not be trusted. His concern was genuine, but it was concern for someone he believed was experiencing delusional thinking rather than someone who had discovered evidence of deliberate animal abuse. "I met with Dr. Henley today," I replied, watching his expression carefully for signs of how this information would be received. She had some follow-up questions about Mabel's toxicology case and wanted to discuss patterns she's been observing in similar poisoning incidents. David's face shifted immediately from cautious optimism to concerned wariness. "Elena, I thought we agreed that continuing to obsess over Mabel's illness wasn't healthy for you. Why are you seeking out additional veterinary consultations when the case was resolved months ago?" The characterization of professional follow-up as obsessive behavior demonstrated how completely Margaret's narrative had infected David's perception of reasonable inquiry. Dr. Henley's request for consultation had been reframed as my pathological inability to accept closure on a resolved medical case. "Dr. Henley contacted me," I clarified, pulling out the documentation from our meeting. "She's been reviewing similar cases and identified patterns that suggest Mabel's poisoning was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of intentional animal abuse." The words hung in the air between us, like an accusation that could not be taken back. David's expression cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and growing alarm as he processed the implications of what I was suggesting. "Elena, please tell me you didn't spend the afternoon convincing a veterinarian to support your conspiracy theories about Mom," he said, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone dealing with escalating mental health symptoms. "This obsession is getting completely out of hand." The automatic assumption that I had manipulated Dr. Henley into supporting predetermined conclusions revealed David's complete inability to consider that professional medical opinion might validate my concerns. In his framework, any expert who agreed with my analysis must have been deceived or influenced, rather than making independent judgments based on evidence. "David, Dr. Henley has identified 3 other cases of mysterious cat poisoning involving the same rare toxin that nearly killed Mabel," I said, spreading the documentation across our dining table. "The pattern suggests deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure, and she's recommending formal investigation by animal control and potentially law enforcement." His reaction was immediate and visceral. "Law enforcement? Elena, you're talking about having my mother investigated for animal abuse based on coincidental similarities between unrelated poisoning cases. This isn't rational analysis. It's persecution based on personal animosity." The characterization of evidence-based professional assessment as persecution revealed how threatening the prospect of formal investigation was to David's fundamental understanding of his family relationships. He could not accommodate the possibility that his mother was capable of deliberate cruelty while maintaining his basic assumptions about her character and motivations. "The evidence speaks for itself," I replied, indicating Dr. Henley's case analysis in the botanical identification materials. "The plant your mother brought yesterday is the same species that poisoned Mabel, and the circumstances surrounding both incidents are consistent with deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where the toxic plant remains safely isolated on our balcony. "Even if everything you're saying is accurate about plant identification and toxicology patterns, you're making an enormous logical leap to conclude that Mom is some kind of serial animal abuser. There have to be other explanations that don't involve accusing family members of criminal behavior." His desperate search for alternative explanations demonstrated the psychological impossibility of accepting that his mother could be capable of such calculated cruelty. The cognitive dissonance between his lifelong trust in Margaret's character and the growing evidence of her deliberate harmful actions created a mental conflict that he resolved by attacking the credibility of the evidence, rather than questioning his assumptions about her nature. "David, I understand this is difficult to accept," I said, attempting to bridge the chasm that was opening between us. "But Dr. Henley has professional expertise in veterinary toxicology, and she's identified patterns that are consistent with systematic animal abuse. This isn't about personal animosity, it's about documented evidence of deliberate poisoning." His face flushed with anger and frustration. "Elena, I'm genuinely concerned about your mental state." This escalation from normal family tensions to accusations of criminal conspiracy suggests that you need immediate professional help. I think we should schedule an appointment with a psychiatrist tomorrow. The threat of forced psychiatric evaluation represented the final weapon in Margaret's arsenal of systematic undermining. If I could be committed for psychiatric treatment based on my evidence-based analysis of suspicious circumstances, then Margaret's crimes would be permanently protected by my official designation as mentally unstable. David, I'm not having a mental health crisis, I said firmly, though my voice trembled with the enormity of what I was about to commit to. I'm following professional medical advice about investigating patterns of intentional animal abuse. Dr. Henley has connected me with Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinary toxicologist who specializes in cases like this. The mention of additional professional involvement caused David's expression to shift from concerned frustration to genuine alarm. Elena, you're building an entire network of people to support conclusions that are based on paranoid speculation about my mother. This isn't normal behavior. The accusation that seeking professional consultation represented paranoid behavior revealed how thoroughly David had been trained to view any challenge to Margaret's innocence as evidence of psychological dysfunction. His worldview could not accommodate the possibility that multiple medical professionals might independently reach conclusions that threatened his mother's reputation. I looked at my husband across our dining table, recognizing that the man I had married no longer existed in any meaningful sense. He had been replaced by someone who automatically dismissed documented evidence when it conflicted with his mother's preferred narrative, someone who viewed professional medical consultation as symptoms of mental illness, and someone who was prepared to have me committed for psychiatric treatment rather than consider the possibility that his mother was capable of deliberate cruelty. David, I'm going to proceed with Dr. Henley's recommendations about formal investigation, I said quietly, the words emerging from some deep place of commitment that had crystallized during our conversation. The evidence is too substantial to ignore, and other animals may be at risk if this pattern continues. His reaction was immediate and explosive. Elena, if you pursue this insane crusade against my mother, our marriage is over. I will not stand by while you destroy our family relationships based on delusional thinking and paranoid accusations. The ultimatum was clear and final. I could abandon my evidence-based conclusions, accept psychiatric treatment for problems I did not have, and return to the false normal of our manipulated family dynamic. Or I could trust professional medical opinion, pursue formal investigation of Margaret's crimes, and face the complete destruction of my marriage and social connections. The choice was terrifying but somehow also liberating. For months I had been trapped in relationships built on my willingness to accept other people's interpretations of reality, even when they contradicted my own direct observations. The prospect of losing everything was devastating, but the alternative was losing myself completely. David, I understand that you're not able to consider the possibility that your mother is capable of the behavior I'm describing, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was committing to. But I cannot ignore documented evidence of deliberate animal abuse, especially when my own pet was the victim and other animals remain at risk. His expression shifted to something I had never seen before, a coldness that suggested he was looking at a stranger rather than his wife. Elena, I want you out of this apartment by the end of the week. I'll be filing for divorce and seeking a restraining order to protect my mother from your harassment. The words hit like physical blows, confirming that the marriage I had tried so hard to preserve had already been destroyed by Margaret's systematic manipulation. David's automatic choice to protect his mother's reputation over investigating documented evidence revealed how thoroughly he had been turned against me. I understand, I replied, though understanding did not diminish the pain of losing everything I had thought mattered to me. I'll be gone by Friday. As David left the apartment that evening, taking his belongings and his unconditional loyalty to his mother, I sat surrounded by the evidence that had cost me my marriage, but might save other animals from suffering the same deliberate cruelty that Mabel had endured. The threshold had been crossed irreversibly, and there was no path back to the comfortable ignorance that had characterized my previous life. The next morning brought a phone call from Dr. Sarah Chen, who had reviewed the documentation Dr. Henley had sent regarding the pattern of suspicious cat poisonings. Her professional assessment confirmed what I had concluded through careful research and what Drive Henley had validated through her clinical expertise. Ms. Chen, the evidence you've compiled is quite compelling, Dr. Chen said during our phone consultation. The pattern of deliberate administration, the use of rare plant toxins, and the systematic undermining of the pet owners all suggest coordinated abuse designed to achieve both immediate harm to the animals and long-term psychological damage to their human companions. The professional confirmation that Margaret's behavior represented a sophisticated pattern of abuse rather than isolated incidents provided validation that carried me through the practical challenges of dismantling my shared life with David. The veterinary toxicologist's expertise lent authority to conclusions that had been dismissed as delusional thinking by those who were psychologically invested in maintaining Margaret's innocence. Dr. Chen, what would you recommend as the next steps for formal investigation of these cases? I asked, recognizing that crossing the threshold required commitment to pursuing justice regardless of personal consequences. Her response was immediate and decisive. We need to document everything thoroughly and contact both Animal Control and the Seattle Police Department. The pattern suggests ongoing criminal behavior that poses risks to both animals and their human companions. I'm prepared to provide expert testimony about the toxicology evidence and the patterns of deliberate administration. The prospect of criminal investigation and potential prosecution created both hope and terror. Margaret would face accountability for her deliberate cruelty, but the legal process would certainly trigger a comprehensive campaign to destroy my credibility and social relationships. The woman who had spent months systematically undermining my confidence would not accept exposure quietly. Dr. Chen, I should mention that the primary suspect is my mother-in-law, and my husband has already filed for divorce and threatened a restraining order to protect her from what he characterizes as harassment based on delusional thinking. I said, wanting to be completely honest about the personal consequences I was facing. Her response was immediate and supportive. Ms. Chen, what you're experiencing is unfortunately typical in these cases. Family members who engage in systematic abuse often have extensive practice in discrediting their victims and turning support systems against them. The fact that you're facing social isolation for reporting documented criminal behavior doesn't invalidate the evidence or make your conclusions less accurate. The professional assessment that my situation was typical rather than unique provided comfort during one of the most isolating periods of my life. Dr. Chen's experience with similar cases created a framework for understanding that the personal costs I was paying were evidence of Margaret's sophisticated manipulation rather than proof that my analysis was flawed. Over the following days, I moved through the practical requirements of pursuing formal investigation while simultaneously preparing to rebuild my life without any of the relationships and security I had taken for granted. The apartment search, the legal consultation about divorce proceedings, and the documentation required for animal control reports created a steady rhythm of tasks that carried me forward when emotional processing became overwhelming. Lisa Rodriguez, the counselor Dr. Henley had recommended, provided crucial support during this transition period. Her expertise in recovery from systematic family manipulation offered both practical guidance and emotional validation for the journey I was undertaking. Elena, the decision to trust your own evidence-based analysis over family pressure to maintain destructive relationships represents enormous courage, Lisa said during our first session. Many people in your situation choose to preserve social connections even when doing so requires abandoning their own judgment and accepting responsibility for crimes they didn't commit. The therapeutic framework that positioned my choice as courageous rather than irrational provided essential support during moments when the magnitude of my losses threatened to overwhelm my commitment to pursuing justice. Lisa's professional understanding of systematic manipulation offered tools for processing the psychological trauma while maintaining focus on the evidence that had started this journey. The recovery process from this type of systematic undermining takes time, but people do regain their confidence in their own judgment and their ability to form healthy relationships, she continued. Often they become advocates for others facing similar situations, using their hard-won wisdom to help people who are trapped in comparable patterns of abuse. The mention of eventual advocacy work resonated with my professional background in helping domestic violence survivors rebuild their identities and reclaim their voices. Perhaps the destruction of my previous life would eventually become the foundation for more meaningful work supporting others who were facing similar battles against systematic manipulation and gaslighting. The formal complaint to Animal Control was filed on Friday morning, accompanied by the comprehensive documentation I had compiled with professional support from Dr. Henley and Dr. Chen. The investigating officer, Detective Maria Santos, reviewed the evidence with the thorough attention of someone trained to evaluate patterns of deliberate harm disguised as accidents or normal family conflict. Ms. Chen, the pattern you've documented is consistent with cases of systematic animal abuse that we've investigated previously, Detective Santos said after reviewing the toxicology reports, botanical identification materials, and timeline of suspicious incidents. The use of rare plant toxins combined with the psychological manipulation of the pet owners represents a sophisticated approach to inflicting harm while avoiding accountability. The law enforcement validation that my evidence represented legitimate criminal investigation rather than harassment based on family animosity provided essential support as Margaret's inevitable counterattack began. Her response to the formal complaint was swift and comprehensive, involving character assassination, claims of mental instability, and attempts to portray herself as the victim of a vindictive daughter-in-law's campaign of persecution. But the threshold had been crossed, and there was no retreat from the commitment to pursuing justice, regardless of personal consequences. The woman who had once accepted blame for crimes she didn't commit and gratefully received gifts that contained hidden dangers had been replaced by someone willing to trust professional expertise over family manipulation, evidence over emotional pressure, and documented facts over comfortable lies. The toxic plant remained on my balcony as I packed my belongings, a beautiful confession that had cost me everything I thought mattered, while revealing the true nature of relationships I had valued above my own judgment. But the evidence it represented had become the foundation for protecting other animals from similar deliberate cruelty and helping other victims recognize patterns of systematic abuse disguised as family concern. The threshold crossed that week was not just about choosing investigation over family harmony. It was about choosing truth over comfort, evidence over manipulation, and personal integrity over social acceptance. The path ahead remained uncertain and potentially dangerous, but it was a path walked with professional support, documented evidence, and the hard-won knowledge that some battles are worth fighting, even when victory requires sacrificing everything you thought you wanted from life. The investigation officially began on a Monday morning in October, 2 weeks after I had filed the formal complaint with Animal Control. Detective Maria Santos contacted me at 7:30 in the morning to schedule an interview and informed me that Margaret Whitmore had already retained legal counsel in response to the allegations. The swiftness of Margaret's legal preparations confirmed that she had been anticipating this confrontation and had developed contingency plans for protecting herself against exposure of her systematic animal abuse. Ms. Chen, I want to prepare you for what we can expect during this investigation, Detective Santos said during our preliminary meeting at the Seattle Police Department. Cases involving family members often become extremely contentious, especially when the accused individual has been building credibility in the community while systematically undermining their target over an extended period. The professional assessment that Margaret had been building community credibility while undermining me provided a framework for understanding the comprehensive nature of her manipulation strategy. This had not been a series of impulsive, cruel acts but rather a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to establish plausible deniability while destroying my ability to report her crimes effectively. Detective Santos, what specific challenges should I anticipate as this process moves forward? I asked, recognizing that crossing the threshold had been only the beginning of a much more complex battle for accountability and justice. Her expression became serious as she reviewed the preliminary information that had been compiled regarding Margaret's response to the investigation. Mrs. Whitmore's attorney has already submitted documentation, claiming that you have a history of mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and vindictive behavior toward family members who have tried to help you. They're building a comprehensive defense based on character assassination, rather than addressing the evidence of animal abuse. The revelation that Margaret had prepared detailed documentation of my supposed psychological and behavioral problems demonstrated the extent to which she had been planning for this eventual confrontation. Every interaction, every moment of resistance to her authority, and every instance where I had questioned her judgment had been cataloged and recontextualized as evidence of my fundamental instability. Additionally, Detective Santos continued, your husband has provided a statement supporting his mother's characterization of your behavior as increasingly paranoid and irrational. He's described a pattern of unfounded accusations and conspiracy theories that he believes represent deteriorating mental health requiring professional intervention. David's formal collaboration with Margaret's legal defense created a profound sense of betrayal that was almost overwhelming. The man who had once respected my analytical abilities and trusted my judgment had become a witness against me in criminal proceedings, providing official testimony that my evidence-based conclusions represented symptoms of psychological dysfunction. Detective Santos, I understand that family dynamics complicate these investigations, I said, struggling to maintain composure while processing the magnitude of the coalition that had formed against me. But the physical evidence and expert testimony should speak independently of personal relationships and character assessments. Her response was measured but supportive. Ms. Chen, the evidence you've provided is substantial and compelling. Dr. Henley's case analysis, Dr. Chen's toxicology assessment, and your botanical documentation create a strong foundation for prosecution, regardless of attempts to discredit your character or motivations. The professional validation that the evidence remained strong, despite personal attacks, provided essential reassurance during a period when every aspect of my credibility and judgment was being systematically challenged by people who had intimate knowledge of my vulnerabilities and insecurities. Over the following days, Margaret's counterattack expanded beyond legal defense to encompass a comprehensive campaign of social destruction designed to isolate me from any potential sources of support or validation. Friends began avoiding me after receiving calls from Margaret expressing concern about my mental state and suggesting that continued association might be enabling dangerous delusional behavior. My college friend Sarah contacted me after receiving one of these calls, her voice filled with confusion and concern. Elena, Margaret called me yesterday and said you've been making serious accusations against her based on paranoid thinking about normal family interactions. She said you're refusing to get professional help and that she's worried you might be dangerous. The efficiency with which Margaret had reached out to my social connections demonstrated her thorough understanding of my support network and her strategic approach to eliminating potential allies. She had not waited for the legal process to unfold, but had immediately begun implementing damage control measures designed to preemptively discredit my version of events. Sarah, Margaret has been systematically poisoning my cat and using the resulting crises to undermine my credibility and control my behavior, I explained, though I could hear the doubt in my friend's voice even as she listened politely to my account of the evidence. Elena, that sounds really extreme, Sarah replied carefully. Are you sure you're interpreting these situations accurately? Maybe there are explanations you haven't considered. Or maybe the stress of marriage and family relationships is affecting your judgment more than you realize. The gentle suggestion that my interpretation of documented evidence might be distorted by stress represented exactly the response Margaret had been cultivating through her preemptive character assassination campaign. Even friends who cared about me were being positioned to doubt my analytical abilities and encourage me to accept psychiatric treatment rather than pursuing criminal investigation. Sarah, I have professional veterinary and toxicology experts supporting my analysis of the evidence, I said, attempting to emphasize the objective foundation for my conclusions. This isn't about stress or family conflict. It's about documented patterns of deliberate animal abuse. The conversation ended with Sarah expressing continued concern about my well-being and suggesting that I consider the possibility that my professional experts might be validating conclusions I had reached for emotional rather than analytical reasons. Margaret's influence had successfully transformed my closest friendships into additional sources of pressure to abandon my evidence-based assessment of her criminal behavior. Similar conversations followed with other friends and professional acquaintances, as Margaret's network of concerned communications expanded throughout my social circle. Each person who contacted me had received carefully crafted information designed to position Margaret as a worried family member, dealing with a mentally unstable relative who was making increasingly dangerous accusations based on delusional thinking. The systematic nature of these communications revealed the sophisticated understanding Margaret had developed regarding psychological manipulation and social isolation techniques. She had not simply denied the charges against her but had created a comprehensive alternative narrative that explained my accusations as symptoms of mental illness while positioning herself as the responsible family member seeking appropriate intervention. However, Margaret's extensive campaign also created opportunities for discovering allies in unexpected places. Dr. Patricia Henley contacted me after receiving a call from Margaret's attorney requesting copies of veterinary records and questioning the basis for her support of my concerns about systematic animal abuse. Elena, the legal inquiry about my professional assessment of Mabel's case was quite revealing, Dr. Henley said during our phone conversation. The attorney was specifically interested in whether I had been influenced by your emotional state or predetermined conclusions rather than making independent medical judgments based on evidence. The attorney's focus on potential manipulation of expert witnesses confirmed that Margaret's legal strategy centered on discrediting professional validation of my analysis rather than addressing the substance of the toxicology evidence and documented patterns of deliberate animal abuse. The questioning actually strengthened my conviction that your analysis is accurate. Drive. Henley continued. The defense strategy of attacking expert credibility, rather than explaining the evidence, suggests that they cannot provide innocent explanations for the documented patterns of mysterious poisoning incidents. Dr. Henley's increased confidence in my conclusions based on the legal defense strategy provided crucial support during a period when Margaret's social manipulation campaign was successfully isolating me from most of my existing support network. Professional expertise remained immune to the character assassination techniques that were proving effective with personal relationships. Dr. Sarah Chen provided similar validation when Margaret's attorney contacted her regarding the toxicology analysis and patterns she had identified across multiple suspicious poisoning cases. Ms. Chen, the legal inquiry about my professional assessment was quite illuminating, she said during our follow-up consultation. The defense appears to be focusing entirely on discrediting witnesses rather than providing alternative explanations for the physical evidence. The pattern of legal challenges to professional expertise rather than substantive defense of the evidence created increasing confidence among the medical professionals that Margaret's behavior represented criminal activity rather than misunderstanding or accidental harm. Their expertise provided a foundation that could not be undermined through social manipulation or character assassination. Lisa Rodriguez, the counselor specializing in recovery from systematic family manipulation, provided essential support for processing the psychological impact of Margaret's comprehensive counterattack. Elena, what you're experiencing represents a typical escalation pattern when systematic abusers are confronted with formal accountability measures, she explained during one of our sessions. The increased intensity of character assassination, social isolation, and attempts to force psychiatric treatment represent desperation rather than strength. She continued. These techniques are most effective when victims are isolated and doubting their own perceptions, but they lose power when professional support systems validate evidence-based analysis. The therapeutic framework that positioned Margaret's escalating attacks as evidence of desperation rather than strength provided essential perspective during moments when the magnitude of her social influence felt overwhelming. Lisa's expertise in systematic manipulation offered tools for maintaining focus on documented evidence, rather than being derailed by emotional manipulation. The investigation progressed methodically, despite Margaret's attempts to control the narrative through legal maneuvering and social pressure. Detective Santos conducted interviews with the other pet owners who had experienced similar mysterious poisoning incidents, and the patterns of systematic undermining following the medical crises became increasingly clear. Ms. Chen, the similarities between your experience and the other cases are remarkable, Detective Santos reported after completing the preliminary interviews. Each victim described gradual erosion of family support, increasing isolation from friends, and persistent suggestions that their concerns about pet safety represented anxiety-driven overreaction. The confirmation that other victims had experienced identical patterns of psychological manipulation following mysterious pet poisonings provided powerful validation that Margaret's behavior represented systematic criminal activity rather than isolated incidents or family conflict. The consistency across multiple cases eliminated the possibility that the patterns were coincidental or misinterpreted. Additionally, Detective Santos continued, we've identified a connection between Mrs. Whitmore and at least two of the other victims through her volunteer work with local garden clubs and pet adoption organizations. She had direct access to information about their pet care routines and household management practices. The discovery that Margaret had used volunteer work to gain access to potential victims demonstrated the premeditated nature of her criminal activity. She had not been randomly poisoning animals, but had been systematically targeting specific individuals whose social isolation and credibility could be effectively managed through her manipulation techniques. Margaret's response to these developments was swift and aggressive. Her attorney filed motions challenging the competency of witnesses, questioning the professional qualifications of expert testimony, and demanding psychiatric evaluation of the primary complainant based on documented evidence of delusional thinking and vindictive behavior toward family members. Ms. Chen, the defense strategy confirms that they cannot provide innocent explanations for the physical evidence, Detective Santos explained after reviewing the legal motions. Their entire approach centers on discrediting you and the professional experts rather than addressing the documented patterns of animal abuse. The legal strategy that focused entirely on character assassination, rather than substantive defense, provided additional confirmation that the evidence was compelling and that Margaret had no innocent explanation for the patterns that had been documented across multiple cases. However, Margaret's legal maneuvering created significant practical challenges for maintaining the investigation's momentum. The demands for psychiatric evaluation, the challenges to expert testimony, and the comprehensive character assassination campaign created pressure from department administrators who were concerned about resource allocation and public perception of controversial family dispute cases. Elena, I want you to understand that bureaucratic pressure doesn't change the strength of the evidence or the validity of your analysis, Detective Santos said during a meeting to discuss these challenges. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that political considerations might affect how aggressively we can pursue prosecution. The acknowledgement that political factors might interfere with evidence-based justice created frustration, but also determination to document everything thoroughly and build the strongest possible case regardless of administrative pressure. Margaret's social influence could complicate the legal process, but it could not change the physical evidence or the expert testimony that supported criminal charges. The period of tests, allies, and enemies had revealed the true nature of relationships I had valued and created new connections with professionals who understood systematic manipulation and criminal behavior. Margaret's comprehensive counterattack had successfully isolated me from most personal relationships, but it had also exposed the sophisticated nature of her criminal enterprise and strengthened professional support for pursuing accountability. The woman who had once valued social harmony above personal safety had been replaced by someone willing to face complete isolation in pursuit of justice for victims who could not protect themselves. The tests had been severe, but they had revealed inner strength and moral clarity that had been dormant during years of accepting manipulation and surrendering judgment to others. Margaret's escalating desperation in response to formal investigation confirmed that she had built her entire social identity on maintaining control through systematic deception and manipulation. The prospect of accountability threatened not just her reputation, but her fundamental understanding of her power and authority over others. The allies who had emerged during this testing period were not the comfortable personal relationships that had characterized my previous life, but rather professional connections based on shared commitment to evidence-based analysis and protection of vulnerable victims. These relationships were more reliable than family bonds because they were founded on professional expertise rather than emotional manipulation. The enemies had also become clear through Margaret's comprehensive response to investigation. David's formal alliance with his mother against documented evidence, the social network that had been turned against me through character assassination, and the legal and political obstacles that protected systematic abusers from accountability, all represented forces that would continue to oppose truth and justice. But the testing period had also revealed that evidence-based analysis supported by professional expertise could withstand personal attacks and social manipulation. The physical proof of Margaret's crimes remained compelling regardless of attempts to discredit those who had documented and analyzed her behavior patterns. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.